Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a moment. So Ed, we're live with the folks that have joined so far. I couldn't let you in without starting it for everyone. So Ed is our co-panelist. I'm Casey Dexter-Lee. We'll get started in just a few minutes.
Thanks everyone for being a little bit early, and thanks so much for joining us today for this presentation in honor of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month.
Thank you to everyone that's joined us so far. We'll get started in about 1 minute.
While we're waiting, if you want to just type into chat and let us know if you've ever been to Angel Island State Park before.
The chat might be turned off.
Oh, then never mind.
Because we are doing an HLP, the interaction is not available. So we'll be posing some questions for you to ponder, but you won't be able to share those with us.
Actually, it looks like some messages are coming through on chat, Casey.
Oh,
so
maybe it's...
We'll see. Well, thank you everyone for joining. And for those of you who've been to Angel Island before, hopefully this is a nice refresher of some of the things that are out there and maybe a little bit of an enticement to come back and visit again. For those of you who've not been to Angel Island yet, hopefully this gives you a little bit of an appetizer for what you can see when you come out and visit this California historic landmark and this National Historic Landmark.
Another thing we can do just as we're getting started here is if you want to put in the chat how many people are watching from your login, just so we can get an idea of how many folks are participating today. We know a lot of you are logging in from schools, and hopefully your classes are getting a chance to virtually visit Angel Island today.
Wow, this is wonderful. We have so many people joining us. It's great to see where y'all are tuning in from and how many people you have watching alongside you. And we're just so excited to be sharing with you some of this important to remember history and also its relevance to everything that's happening in the world around us today.
All right, Ed, if you're ready, I am. I think we're ready to start. Oh. I lost your audio though.
With that, I am going to share my screen then. And so welcome again, everyone, to this presentation, this special home learning presentation in recognition of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. My name is Edward Tepporn. I am the Executive Director for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, and we are the primary nonprofit partner that works in partnership with Angel Island State Park to help preserve the buildings at the former immigration station, to fundraise and to help with some of the educational programs like the one that you're tuned in today. For me, Angel Island is a very important place. It's actually not a place that I learned about in school, but something that I learned about after I moved here to the Bay Area. But once I had a chance to visit Angel Island and step foot inside the former detention barracks, it really resonated for me because I'm an immigrant myself. My family and I came to the United States when I was about 1.5 years old. And where we grew up in the southern part of the country, we experienced a lot of racism and xenophobia and people who told us that we didn't belong here, people who told us to go back to where we came from. And so for me, what Angel Island represents is a reminder that there was a time in our nation's history when unfortunately our country tried to keep certain groups of immigrants out, in particular Asians and Pacific Islanders, and that history continues to today. What Angel Island for me also represents with some of the new exhibits that we have at the Angel Island Immigration Museum is a reminder of the amazing journeys, sometimes very challenging and difficult, but the strength, the perseverance, the endurance that immigrants across time, those who came through Angel Island, as well as those who are coming to the US today, have really taken on in terms of their attempts to come to the US, to become contributing parts of our community, and all the amazing contributions that they have helped to generate for the state of California and for our entire country. And Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is all about remembering those histories, those journeys. So we remember both the tougher times as well as the important contributions and the role models that our community has to offer. Casey, do you want to also quickly introduce yourself?
Of course, thank you. My name is Casey Dexter-Lee. I'm an interpreter with California State Parks, and I've lived and worked here on Angel Island for over 20 years, and am excited to share the story of Angel Island's immigration station with everyone today. We are a California state park, one of about 280 state parks in California, and Angel Island is located in the middle of San Francisco Bay. We are neighbors to our more famous island to the south, Alcatraz. And from the island perspective, where the immigration station sits is on the north side of the island, facing towards the Richmond and San Rafael Bridge. And it's Angel Island, the largest island in San Francisco Bay, and about 1 square mile in size. You can come and visit the park. There are ferries that come from Tepporn in Marin County, or from San Francisco out of the ferry building with Golden Gate Transit. So there are opportunities for folks to visit the park and the immigration station. The building I'm in, the Detention Barracks Museum, is open Wednesday through Sunday. And we also have a second museum space that talks about historic and contemporary immigration at the site called AIM, or the Angel Island Immigration Museum, that's currently open on weekends. And we hope you all get a chance to visit in person if you don't get every question answered today, but also if you want to learn more about the stories of Angel Island.
And just to give you a quick snapshot of our roadmap for the next 50 minutes or so, we'll have Casey leading all of you through a live tour of one of the historic buildings at the Angel Island Immigration Station. Next up then, because it's Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, I will be leading you through a series of games that you can play in your classrooms, in your homes. And so if you have a piece of paper ready, you might want to grab some pen and paper or pencil and paper to get ready for that part of our time together today. And then finally, Casey will be back on screen to take you through one of our newest exhibits at the Angel Island Immigration Station. It's a temporary exhibit that we're going to have up for the month of May called Lighting the Darkness. So with that, Casey, I'll turn it back over to you to take us through parts of the Angel Island Immigration Station.
Thank you, Ed. As I mentioned, I'm in the detention barracks, which is one of the buildings that was part of the U.S. Immigration Station on Angel Island. This facility operated between 1910 and 1940, so only for 30 years, so a very short amount of time in the grand scheme of immigration to the United States. But this site had a big impact. Angel Island's immigration facility was built to help enforce the Chinese exclusion laws and was used to detain people from all over the world. The people that were coming here represent about 80 different countries, but the largest group came from China, and they represent about 1/3 of all immigrants that came to Angel Island. The second largest group was from Japan. There were just slightly fewer Japanese immigrants than Chinese immigrants detained here. So they represent just under 1/3. And the last third is the 78 other countries. So odds are, if you can think of a country, there's probably a connection to Angel Island in those stories of moving to the United States. We are located on an island, and that was a choice made by the Immigration Service to try and isolate immigrants from previous places where people were detained in San Francisco. But to understand how we got to this point of having an immigration station on Angel Island, we have to go back a little further in time. And the story of Chinese immigration to the United States really starts with the gold rush in California. And I bet a lot of you that are from California schools have learned about the gold rush, especially our fourth graders. But that is, gold is discovered in 1848. The gold rush starts in 1849, where people were rushing to California to find their fortunes in the gold fields. And people came from all over the world. I grew up near a town called Sonora, which was named after Mexican miners that came up from the region of Sonora. But Chinese immigrants came as well during this period, and for the first time in larger numbers. In 1848, there were about 50 Chinese people in America, in the entire country. By 1851, there's about 20,000 Chinese people in America. So a big demographic shift. And most of those folks are settling here in the West. So we see discrimination against Chinese immigrants very early on. Local laws start being passed at the city, county, and even state level to restrict what Chinese immigrants can do while they are here. There were laws that said, eventually, that said if you were a foreign miner, you had to pay a tax simply for being from another country. If you were Chinese, you could not own property. You could not testify in court against a white person, which meant that you were subject to violence because you couldn't stand up in court and say that person stole from me or harmed me. You also could not attend public school if you were Chinese. So these laws are getting stricter and stricter. There's a lot of discrimination and violence against Chinese people. And so that's why we see a lot of Chinatowns, areas where people with Chinese ancestry gathered to have some protection from the experience of that violence. So we also see a shift in what Chinese immigrants are doing to make a living, because laws were passed to restrict their ability to look for gold unless someone had already looked in that area for gold. Chinese immigrants started working in other industries to serve the gold rush. So they went into businesses such as selling tools that were necessary for looking for gold. They went into businesses like restaurants, or sometimes even laundries. All the things that miners needed. They needed food, they needed tools, they needed their clothes to be cleaned, and they might have a little bit of money because they have found a little bit of gold to pay for those things. So a lot of people that went into these other industries around the actual gold mining tended to do better in the long run, because not everyone was lucky enough to find gold. So we have another group of Chinese immigrants that start coming in, especially in the 1860s, during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese workers were actually asked to come to America to help build the railroad. because the railroad barons that were making the construction happen knew that the Chinese workers were very good at their jobs. The Chinese had a reputation for being hard workers. They also had a long history of working the land, terracing. China is where explosives were invented. So some of the Chinese workers on the railroad helped use explosives to build tunnels, especially here in California and in the western region where they were building, where we had to go through the Sierra Nevadas as well as Rocky Mountains. And the Chinese also had a reputation in the United States for being willing to work for lower wages. And so if you're in charge of building the railroad, that is an employee that you want because you don't have to pay them as much. Now, they treated people differently, and of course that's not fair, but people came nonetheless to try and find work here in the United States. So we have a big increase in the number of Chinese people, and these laws start getting stricter and stricter. So one of the laws that was finally passed in 1882 was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this was a law that was meant to keep Chinese people out of the United States. The people that were coming for laboring jobs, so work that had been like the railroad, but the railroad is now complete, they're being excluded from coming to the United States. Now, there are exceptions to the rule, and the rule was only supposed to last for 10 years. The Chinese Exclusion Act or Chinese exclusion laws, these series of laws, were extended for 10 years beyond that and extended again and eventually made indefinite. They weren't actually repealed until 1943 during World War II. So we have this very long period where Chinese people are not welcomed into the United States. Now, some of the people that were allowed to come from China are people like students. So a lot of you watching today are students. You would be allowed to come in during Chinese exclusion if you could prove you were a student. You could also come as a teacher, a tourist, a merchant, someone doing business, as well as the child of an American citizen. So let's get some productive talk going in that chat. So I'm going to take you over to a photo in this room over here. This is one of the rooms where Chinese men were held. And I'm going to show you a photo of an entry hearing. Now, this entry hearing is actually a Japanese couple that is being questioned. And they had two inspectors, a stenographer writing things down, and this person may be a translator. And then we have two people here that are answering their questions. And this is similar to how the interrogations or entry hearings were conducted for all immigrants. Now, for Chinese immigrants, the questions were usually quite in-depth. So because people could come as the children of American citizens, they were sometimes pretending to be in someone else's family so they could get around the racist laws that excluded Chinese people. Now, I can safely say these laws were racist because they did not actually care if you were from China. They only cared if your ancestry was Chinese. So if you were born in any other country of the world, if you were born in France or South Africa or Brazil or Chile, and you had Chinese ancestry and you tried to come to the United States under the Chinese exclusion law era, you could be excluded. So these questions are meant to try and tell who is telling the truth about their relationships.
I'm sorry to interrupt. It seems like we have some individuals in the chat who are being disrespectful. I don't believe there's a way to turn off the chat on our end. So for viewers, if you want to just close out your chat box, we apologize for the viewers who are unfortunately distracting from this presentation.
All right, let's see if I can just turn that off. Let's find our If someone was to remind me in the settings how to turn chat off.
Or if you want to make me a co-host, Casey, I can also try to figure out while you're presenting.
Chat, right click. I'm not having, I will make you I think you are a co-host. It's not showing up, the option's not showing up on mine. So, okay. So Chinese exclusion laws, right? People are trying to come in, they're trying to prove that they are the children of American citizens. Some people had become paper sons and daughters, pretending to be the children of American citizens to get around the laws that restricted their ability to come here. And so these questions were asked of people so that they, the immigration officials, would try to figure out who was allowed in and who was not. So one of the typical questions you might be asked is, how many windows are in your house? What are the birth dates and death dates of your grandparents and your great grandparents? What is the name of the family that lives in the third house in the second row in your village? Now, these are not all questions that are easily answered today. A lot of these would have been a little easier if to answer historically. And that's because a lot of people were living in rural areas. Their home might not have any windows. I've seen transcripts from people that answered that question by saying there are no windows, but there's one skylight. And we definitely see people not being able to answer these questions. But the most important thing is that the immigrant coming in is having their answers compared with usually their father. And they are interviewed separately, so they can't hear what the other person says. And those answers are compared by the immigration officials. And if they think that the answers match, then they will let people in. And if they don't see the answers matching, or even if the answers match, but they don't believe the immigrant, if they don't think that person's telling the truth, they can still try to deport them. Now, about 50%, half of all Chinese immigrants failed the entry hearing when they initially came to Angel Island. But there was a way to appeal. All righty.
That is not appropriate. Unfortunately, we're not able to close out the chat on this end, and apologies for the obscenities that are in the chat room.
Okay. Let's work on this problem right now. Are you able to boot that person?
I am in the process of trying to do so. They are signed in multiple times.
Okay. All right. I'll be honest, if it gets too bad, we're gonna just shut down the whole program. So that's up to you, participants. So we have people that are being detained here. And one of the things that people did while they were here, waiting for that outcome, wondering if their appeal of that initial failure might work, is they started writing on the walls. And when they write on the walls, people, some people wrote what you might expect, kind of typical graffiti, names, dates, hometowns, which we actually get a lot of information from because we're able to research those folks that wrote their names. But the vast majority of the writing on the wall is actually poetry. And in this spot, we can see some of that writing. Now, this poem is actually a little larger. It starts up here, goes down 7 characters and 4 lines. And the English translation of this poem, which is written in Chinese, is 1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows. Hoping to step ashore the American continent, is the most difficult of difficulties. The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance. And you can hear a lot of very strong emotions in this poem. We have poems on the walls that reflect all of the broad emotions that people were feeling while they were here. There's poetry about the long journey on the ship, sometimes taking 3 weeks to get here if you cross the Pacific Ocean. There's poems about the medical exams that you had to pass to get in. Some immigrants, especially Asian immigrants, had to submit stool samples to be inspected for parasites, and sometimes blood samples as well. There are poems about the bad food in the dining hall. And there were a lot of complaints about the food from many of the people that stayed here. And there's poetry about the conditions here, about being in a crowded room with lots of beds. There's poetry about the poetry. There's a poem in another room downstairs where also Chinese men were held that says there are tens of thousands of poems on these walls. They're all cries of complaint and sadness. So we have a space here where we have reproduction bunks. This room was considered healthy for 25 people, and it had 100 beds. So about 4 times the healthy capacity of what should have been in here could be here at one time. But people did arrive by boat, and the large ocean-going ships that came in through the Golden Gate, even before the bridge was built across it, they would be met by ferry boats from the immigration and separately the customs and also quarantine services. So those smaller ferry boats would decide who would have to come off the boat and be sent here to Angel Island. The immigration station on Angel Island did have a hospital, but there was also a quarantine station on Angel Island in Ayala Cove, where the ferries land today. And so you might be sent to the quarantine station even if you didn't have any issues with coming into the country. So American citizens, other immigrants that had been here before or didn't have difficulty entering would be there. Anyone that had an immigration hiccup would be sent to the immigration station, but they also might be sent to the hospital at the immigration station if they had a health issue. These beds are foldable, so you can actually fold them up to move them into an upright locked position. So if it's not being used because you're coming by the boatload, there's big groups coming in and then numbers dwindle down as some people are allowed to leave and go to San Francisco and others are deported. So if the beds were unoccupied, you could fold them up to get them out of the way and create a little more elbow room. But as you can see, there's a kind of a narrow walkway between all of the beds, triple layer bunk beds that are designed similar to what they had on ships of the time. And each immigrant was given a mattress, a pillow, and a blanket. And that is except for when the immigration station first opened, the Chinese men were not given mattresses. So they just had the pillow and blanket. And when the Chinese men found out that other people that were staying here got mattresses and they did not, they protested. And part of the reason this initially happened may have been because of cultural misunderstandings, but also bias. So sleeping mats like this were common in particularly rural China in the summer. But when the when the immigration officials, when they looked at these sleeping mats, they said, well, the Chinese men probably don't want a mattress, which was a really not a great misunderstanding because it meant that people were sleeping on kind of metal beds just with a blanket. Now, the Chinese women were given mattresses, but not the men. So I don't know what the immigration officials thought was so different about where Chinese women were sleeping from Chinese men. right? They all lived in the same homes, but the protests worked and Chinese men were given mattresses. They also protest about the food that I mentioned in the poems. There's a poem that says they treat us Chinese badly and feed us yellowed greens, which we think is a reference to salted cabbage. The food initially was the same for everyone, a more European style stew type food. And when the Chinese immigrants protested, eventually they were able to get Chinese cooks to make Chinese food as well as a European meal for others. But not everyone here was from Europe or China. And so there were still a lot of complaints about the food, but always the quality. Everyone was complaining about the quality of the food. All right, I want to show you one other thing on the wall. Oh, actually, let's show you the exercise yard. So not everyone can stay inside all the time. So there were exercise yards for folks to go out into. And this was the Asian recreation yard. Now there's a building that was built on top of that yard later during World War II, but the roof was built over the yard. And this is an area where people could go outside during the day. Now the area for Europeans to go outside was called the European playground. So even the way the different areas were labeled shows that people are being treated differently. The Asian recreation yard or the European playground, which one would you want to hang out in? You can see we also have some students out here visiting the park today. And they're learning the stories of Angel Island as well. Also want to remind you, when you look out the window here, we see some caging between us and outside. And that's because this place was a detention facility. The people that were staying here could not do as they wanted. They had to go outside when they were allowed to go. They had meals when they were told to have meals. This caging on the windows was meant to stop people from escaping. There's also a fence around the exercise yard that had barbed wire at the top. And there's a fence around this whole part of Angel Island to separate it from the rest of the island, which was the military. And that had barbed wire at the top. And then the whole facility is on an island, which made escape difficult. All right, Ed, I think I'm going to turn things over to you.
All right.
For part
Casey,
two.
before I start though, we did have a question from Jacqueline who asked, was the Asian recreation area and European playground different sizes?
They were similar sizes. They look very different today because that building is there taking up most of the space in the Asian recreation yard. And we know that whenever they're saying European here historically, what they mean is white. Because it was about what you looked like on the outside, not again where you were from. And they segregated here racially into three categories: European, Asian, and Chinese. So Chinese immigrants had a different experience than other Asian immigrants because of the Chinese exclusion laws.
Another question is, how long did Europeans stay on Angel Island?
So the average stay on Angel Island is 2 to 3 days, and that's for most immigrants from Europe, Japan. The Chinese immigrants stayed on average 3.5 weeks. And that is not an experience that most people had, because most Chinese immigrants were here either 2 or 3 days or 3.5 months. And when you average that, you get that 3-week number that not a lot of people experience. So it's either relatively easy, 2 or 3 days, which is still a long time compared to Ellis Island, where people only had to stay a few hours, maybe 5 hours, or you were here for months. Now, the longest stay on record is 22 months, almost 2 years. So if you were appealing that if you failed your entry hearing and you appealed, you would sometimes have to stay the entire time you were appealing. And it didn't necessarily mean you were going to be successful and be able to stay. You might still get deported.
There's a couple more questions, Casey. One comes from Patricia, and her question is, are there multiple detention rooms?
Yes, so there's one building that was the main building to detain people, but the Europeans were separated from Asians, who were separated from Chinese immigrants. And so we have basically 4 main rooms that were used as those kind of separated barracks. And then there's a few smaller rooms inside. Some of them were used as sitting rooms, but at other times were used to house other groups, especially, there's one room where we see writing from India, Tahiti, I think New Zealand. So there a lot of times there was people that maybe were harder for the immigration officials to easily categorize. And so also you would be treated differently based on class. So if you were traveling in first class, you probably didn't have to come to Angel Island at all. But if you were traveling in second or third class is also sometimes called steerage because it's down where the steering parts of the boat are, you would most likely have to come to Angel Island. But some people were traveling back and forth. So if you were already in the United States and wanted to leave and maybe come back someday, you needed to make sure to file papers, especially if you had Chinese ancestry, that showed you had already been here, because that way when you came back, you could say, oh yes, I filed those papers, and you could easily come back into the country rather than being sent to Angel Island potentially again.
So Casey, the immigration station is no longer functioning as an immigration station. What were the years that it was open?
So it operated as an immigration station from 1910 to 1940, and then it had a second life during World War II as a prisoner of war detention facility. They also interned Japanese Americans here temporarily. So this top layer of paint, this yellow and gray, is all from that from the World War II era. And that poem I read for you with the green squares and brown squares, that shows all the different layers of paint that were put on the walls over the years, trying to cover up the writing that was here in the building. The immigration officials didn't want people to write on the walls, and they wanted, people to not do that. And so they painted the walls to try and get rid of that writing. But some of what they did actually helped preserve the writing. So they puttied in the writing in a lot of places. And I'm zooming in. This is what I was talking about before. Some of the writings from New Zealand and Tahiti. And we also see writing from India in this room. You can see the word Bombay. But this is actually one of those rooms I was talking about that had different uses at different times. It had this version, which is basically a setup as an indoor recreation room, because it's not always great weather here on Angel Island. And so the people would sometimes have to stay inside all day. And so there's a record player or phonograph. And the Chinese men, especially because they were the largest group and here longer, they organized. They had the Angel Island Liberty Association. So people would pay dues into it that would help make records and newspapers, help people connect to lawyers. You couldn't actually talk to your lawyer when you were here, but your lawyer could file on your behalf and help you appeal.
We've got a lot of great questions coming in. We'll maybe take 2 more. We'll move to the next section of our presentation, and then we'll see if we can't come back to some of these other questions if there's time. But one question that comes from Lincoln, Casey, is what did the Europeans eat? Was it the same food as the people from Asia and China?
So the European meal tended to be more stew type food, kind of everything mixed together in one pot. So beef stew would be a very common meal here. The thing also to remember is for most other groups besides Chinese, the stay was shorter. So if you kind of got stuck eating beef stew 2 or 3 times over 2 or 3 days, you could probably be, okay, that's, it's not the best, but this is what there is. But if you're stuck here for 3 months and you're having food that's not that great and not great quality, that is when it starts getting a little tougher for people to put up with. And that's where you see those protests happening.
And then I'll take the last question and then transition into my portion of the presentation. And the question is, are there connections between the ways that African Americans have been treated in the United States and the way that Chinese people have been treated? And so I think the short answer to that is there are similarities and there are differences. But one of the similarities is that for African Americans and for Chinese, there have been certain laws and policies that have been put in place historically that were unfair and unjust and treated them as different from others. And so that is definitely a shared experience. We also know from some of the immigration records that there were immigrants from Africa who came through the Angel Island immigration station, though not as many as those from Asia and the Pacific. But it's part of these experiences that different communities have had, whether it's the African American community or the Hispanic community or the Jewish community, or in the case of May, the Asian Pacific American community. It's why having these types of heritage months is important, so that we all have an opportunity to learn about our own and each other's histories, to recognize these different parts of history that have happened, but also to celebrate the role models, the leaders, the accomplishments and contributions that all of these diverse communities make for our country. And so with that, I'm going to share my slide, and I have a couple of questions that I'd like to lead the group through. And feel free to play along on your own if you're watching from home, or if you're in a classroom or watching in school, you also have the opportunity to answer these questions for yourselves. And so over these next couple of slides, I just have some fun facts and some questions related to Asian and Pacific American Heritage Month. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that we don't have to celebrate Asian Pacific Islander American Heritage Month just in the month of May. And the reality is that we can actually celebrate that every day. And just to give you an example of that, I want you to imagine this day. This is actually a piece that was written by a friend of mine, Frances Kaiwa Wang, and she encourages us to just imagine this day, and I'll read what Frances wrote. So imagine that you were sound asleep in bed and suddenly you were woken up by an earthquake. Your mommy tells you it was 7.0 on the Richter scale and the epicenter was on the other side of town. You get dressed in a cotton t-shirt and blue jeans, you tie your hair back with a bandana, and you put on a pearl necklace that your grandmother gave you. You go down to breakfast and have oatmeal with brown sugar sprinkled on top and a glass of orange juice. You ride your horse to school. You put your feet in the stirrups and you use your compass to find your way. Today, you have a chess class before school. At school, you read a new book called Horrible Harry and the Green Slime and write in your journal. In math, you learn how to add zeros. And at choice time, you work on the computer. You play a new software by putting in a CD-ROM. In art class, you make tie-dye t-shirts. At recess, you play with yo-yos or cat's cradle with your friends. You might play rock, paper, scissors to see who goes first. At lunch, it's raining, so you stay inside and play Chutes and Ladders or Parcheesi. After school, your mommy picks you up and takes you out with her to the polling booth because it's election day and she has to vote. It's still raining, so you use your umbrella when you get out of the car. When you get home, you start by playing Nintendo or Game Boy. But your mommy says that you have to do your homework first. After homework, you go out to the park to fly your kite. And then you watch Jackie Chan Adventures or Sailor Moon cartoons on TV. You help your parents push the wheelbarrow as they work in the garden. Then you have dinner, teriyaki burgers and pineapple juice. Then they make a cherry pie for dessert, your favorite. Then you go to soccer practice, and after soccer practice, you have martial arts class. And after martial arts class, you have hula dancing lessons. And after your lessons are all finished, it's just starting to get dark. Did I mention that it's the 4th of July? So your family goes out to watch fireworks. Afterwards, you go home to take a bath, shampoo your hair, and put on your favorite Hello Kitty pajamas. You ask to watch your favorite Mulan DVD, but instead your dad reads you Cinderella for your bedtime story. What a day, right? And in reading that excerpt that my friend wrote, what she's emphasizing is there are many parts of our day filled with different inventions that were invented by people who are of Asian or Pacific Islander heritage, or who are Asian American or Pacific Islander American. So I think that's just a fun introduction to encourage us to take a look around us in our homes, in our classrooms, and think about who might have invented that. Was it perhaps someone who was Asian Pacific Islander? Was it perhaps someone who's an immigrant? So a couple of other examples of inventions that trace their ways back to the Asian and Pacific Islander countries. Kites. Did you know that kites were invented by the Chinese? We heard in that little excerpt that the game of chess, that was actually invented in India. And then Hello Kitty and Pokemon, those of course were invented by the Japanese. So when we talk about Asian and Pacific American Heritage Month, that term, Asian and Pacific American, is actually a set of words that is meant to include a number of different countries from across Asia and the Pacific. And so I want to ask you who are watching to take out a sheet of paper and a pen or pencil and write down in the next 30 seconds, how many Asian and Pacific Islander countries can you think of? And so I'm going to be quiet and I'm going to give you 30 seconds and I'll let you know when to put your pens and pencils down. You have 20 seconds to go. In 10 seconds. 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1. Time's up, pencils down. So let's see how many countries you got. On this next slide are just a number of the different countries that are part of what we refer to when we use the term Asian and Pacific Islander. And for every country that you see on the screen, it's important to remember that each of these countries oftentimes has their own set of histories, their own cultures and norms, their own languages, their own traditions. And so while it's wonderful to have this term Asian Pacific Islander to include all of these different countries, it's also important to remember that each of these countries can be very unique and very diverse. So this is just a map. And so when we refer to Asian and Pacific Islander countries, we're referring to mostly these countries that are in the center part of this map. And it stretches all the way from here down into this region here. And part of Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is the opportunity for each of us to share some of our own stories. For those of us who identify as being Asian or Pacific Islander or Native Hawaiian even, or who come from families that are of that ancestry. And so I wanted to share a story from when I was in elementary school. I grew up in Texas in the 1970s and 80s. I know that was a very long time ago. But one of the things that sometimes my friends would ask me is, where are you from? And then I would tell them, well, I'm from here, I'm from Texas. And then they would ask me, but where are you really from? And sometimes when you are Asian Pacific Islander and you hear that question, where are you really from? What we hear is that someone is telling us that we're not fully American or we don't belong here. So for those of you who are watching, if you've ever used that question before, it's okay. Maybe you didn't know better. You didn't know that that was what some people might hear when you ask that question. But if you ever ask the question where someone is from and they respond, then just listen to them and accept whatever it is that they say and try to avoid using that question, where are you really from? Because that can actually hurt some people's feelings. A flip side of that question is, if you have friends who are Asian and Pacific Islander, how can you be a better friend or classmate for them? And I want to tell you the story of a classmate I had named Hector. So Hector was Mexican and I am Thai. And a lot of times our parents would pack our lunches for us. One of my favorite things to eat was something called a chive cake. And it's a round flat circle made of dough, and stuffed inside of it is chopped up chives. And those chopped up chives kind of look like grass sometimes, if you're not familiar with them. So some of my classmates would tease me that I was eating grass. But Hector wasn't one of those classmates. Hector was curious about what the chive cakes that my parents packed for me tasted like. And so several times during lunch break, we would actually trade lunches. And so Hector would get, my mom would actually pack an extra chive cake so that Hector could have it. And then Hector's mom would pack an extra bean burrito so that I could taste that. And that was one of the ways that I got to learn about a culture that I wasn't familiar with, that I wasn't from. And food is a wonderful way to start to learn about the rich traditions that different cultures have. So that's just one way that you can potentially be a better friend or classmate, is to think about how can you make someone else feel like they're welcome and how they belong. And so I also encourage each of you to continue to think about, even after this presentation, if you have an Asian or Pacific Islander friend, how can you make them feel like they belong and that they're welcome? So I mentioned that chive cakes were my favorite food. My next question for all of you, and you can either answer that amongst yourselves or write it down on paper, is what is your favorite Asian or Pacific Islander food? And I'll give you just a few seconds to come up with an answer. I bet there's a lot of really great foods that you are thinking about. I just wanted to show on screen two more foods that I really enjoy. On the left-hand side of the screen are Vietnamese chao chow, or spring rolls. And so these are often made of these rice paper that you then stuff with vegetables. Sometimes you might have carrots or pork and shrimp. Different families have different recipes. And then that all gets deep fried. And we know that whenever you deep fry something, it's not necessarily the healthiest, but sometimes it tastes especially tasty. On the right-hand side, you see Thai green curry. And so I remember as a child, my mom and dad would make green curry at home. And when you make green curry, it can be very fragrant, and it was not actually a fragrance that I enjoyed as a kid. But now as an adult, it's actually one of my favorite foods. And I love the color. I love the spiciness and the saltiness and the sweetness all combined into one. And so if you've never had Thai curry before and you want to try it, my suggestion to you would be, if your parents are making it or if you order from a restaurant, ask them to make it mild first, because Thai curries can be very, very spicy. And then again, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month is an opportunity for us to think about who some amazing role models are who identify as Asian Pacific Islander. And on these next couple of slides, I'll share just a handful, and there are many, many more that we don't have the time to include for today's presentation. But one of those individuals is Tyrus Wong. So you may not know Tyrus by his name, but if any of you have ever seen the movie Bambi, he was responsible for painting the beautiful backdrops that you see in the background of the movie. And Tyrus was actually detained on Angel Island as a young boy, and ultimately was allowed into the US and later became an animator for the Walt Disney Company. Kalpana Chawla, who was the first Indian American woman in space. Ali'i Carvalho, who is, I'm sure, someone that many of you know if you've seen the movie Moana. She's a Hawaiian actress and singer. And then here's perhaps someone else that might look familiar to you, Dwayne Johnson, also known as The Rock. So he's a wrestler and actor, and Dwayne happens to be of Black and Samoan ancestry. And so we know that just because someone might be Asian Pacific Islander and perhaps another race, Black or Hispanic or white, that doesn't make them any less of an Asian Pacific Islander. And we welcome anyone who has Asian Pacific Islander ancestry, whether it's both parents or one parent or both grandparents or all four grandparents. It's such a beautifully diverse diaspora that we have. Diaspora is essentially another word for a large community. And so the Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander communities are so beautifully diverse. And I think one of the things that I really appreciate thinking about is how we as Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders can also be inclusive in our communities. And then finally, I did want to acknowledge the late Norman Mineta, who unfortunately passed away earlier this week at the age of 90 years old. He was a tremendous leader and was a former mayor of San Jose. If any of you are tuning in from San Jose, he was a US congressperson, and he also served 2 times as a US cabinet secretary. So that doesn't mean that he was a secretary of a physical cabinet that you put clothes in, but a cabinet is part of our US government, and he was responsible for overseeing, one of the cabinet posts he has was responsible for overseeing some of the policies and procedures related to transportation in our country. And Norman Mineta's mother, Kane, was actually detained on Angel Island. But role models don't have to be famous celebrities. And so what I encourage you now to take a few moments just to think about is, who is just one Asian or Pacific Islander you might know who you look up to? And just either think about that or take a moment to write that person's name down. And what is it about them that makes you look up to them? So with that wraps up my portion of this presentation. I want to say thank you. I want to say in my native language of Thai, Khop Kun Kap. And if I was a girl, I would say Khop Kun Ka. And I'll turn it back over to you, Casey, to take us home for the final part of today's presentation.
Thank you, Ed. It was so great learning a little bit more about your experience growing up. And I've moved down to the first floor of the barracks of the immigration station. And the reason I did that is because we have a new exhibit here. And this is a temporary exhibit just for the month of May, for Asian Pacific Islander Heritage Month, and it's called Lighting the Darkness. This year, actually tomorrow, is 140 years since the first Chinese Exclusion Act was put into law in the United States. And we wanted to not celebrate that because it was a law that has been thrown out because it's been decided that it's unfair, but we wanted to make sure to remember it. And so we call that commemorating. So we're commemorating that moment in our history. And part of the reason this exhibit is called Lighting the Darkness is we want people to take that maybe dark moment in our history and try to make it a little better, a little brighter. And so what we have are 140 candles representing every year since the Chinese exclusion laws started. And what I'd like to do for you is I'd like to turn them on and light the darkness a little here. And while we take in all 140 candles, I was going to answer some of those questions that people were putting into the chat. So one of the questions I saw asked if men and women were separated here. And the answer to that is yes. And their follow-up question is, did that mean that families were separated from each other? And that answer is also yes. So men and women were separated here on Angel Island. Children usually stayed with their mothers unless they were a boy around the age of 12. And at 12 years old, you were considered old enough to go to the men's side. But you also have to remember that not everyone came with their parents. Remember, some of those people are coming back in. They filed that paperwork so they wouldn't have to come to Angel Island. Well, some of them came back, but brought a child with them. And so that child would have to come to Angel Island. They would not. And so there were a lot of young people that were here by themselves. And I've heard, I've actually met people as young as 9 years old that were, he was a boy, and so he was sent to the men's side, even though he was not with a male relative, and he did not have a female relative either. And he was sent at 9 years old because he was tall for his age. And so the immigration officials held him with the men. Another question I saw in the chat is, how did people write on the walls? And the answer might seem very simple. The answer is knives and carving tools. While people here were treated a lot like prisoners, and they talked about themselves as prisoners in the poetry on the walls, they were not prisoners in a traditional modern sense of someone that's gone to a trial, been convicted of a crime, and sent to prison. So the people here were allowed to have personal items. They could bring a kind of a suitcase, a small suitcase with them in the building. Bigger items were stored in a warehouse out on the dock where they arrived. But you could have knives and carving tools because the people here were not seen as a physical threat. The other part of that is, if you were detained here and you were violent, it would be a very easy reason for the American officials to deport you. So most people were not causing harm to anyone here. They were just people that were trying to move from one place to another. Another question I saw was, how old is Angel Island? Angel Island is been an island for about 10,000 years, since the last ice age, when sea level rose and isolated Angel Island from the other parts of what we now call the San Francisco Bay Area. And another question I saw was about escaping. There weren't a lot of escapes. There were a few people that did escape. If you'd been caught during escape, you definitely would have been deported, but the few people that did escape were never found. So they were successful in escaping Angel Island. So they either swam to the mainland. The closest land is the Marin Peninsula in the town of Tepporn, or potentially maybe to a boat. But we don't know what happened to those folks because they got away. So I do want to say thank you very much for coming and learning a little more about the Angel Island Immigration Station, as well as Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I'll let Ed say his goodbyes as well.
Just thank you again, everyone, for tuning in. Apologies for the hiccups in chat. We really are so sorry that happened, but we appreciate you tuning in to learn a little bit more about Angel Island, and also appreciate your curiosity about learning more about Asian and Pacific American heritage.
All right. Thank you to everyone.
Bye, everyone. Have a wonderful day.
Oh, please come visit Angel Island.